Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Jian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin our show today in Europe, where Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is on a 3-day visit to Germany. He also attended the 8th Hamburg Summit, a leading economic conference on China-Europe affairs. Before we get down to business, let's take a look at this.
Officials, scholars, and entrepreneurs from China and Germany are meeting in the city of Hamburg to discuss economic cooperation against the backdrop of rising protectionism. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He delivered a keynote address at the summit. The China Proposed Belt and Road Initiative takes center stage at the 2-day gathering, which is themed Hamburg Summit, China Meets Europe. In an opening speech on Monday, former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder said the opportunities created by the Belt and Road Initiative will bring people and businesses in Asia and Europe closer together. This summit was initiated by the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce in 2004, aiming to help China and Europe enhance their economic relations through dialogue. 2018 marks the 14th consecutive year since the European Union became China's largest trading partner, and China, the EU's second largest export market and largest source of imports. The bilateral trade volume between China and the EU rose 13.4% to about $401 billion from January through July this year. The EU's investment in China also surged to $8.5 billion by the end of September. That was an increase of 22.3% year-on-year. Amid a complex and volatile international landscape, both China and Europe seek to counter isolationism with more exchange and cooperation.
More discussion on the China-EU relations, particularly when it comes to trade and economic ties. In our Beijing studio, Liu Mingli, Deputy Director of the Institute of European Studies with the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Shanghai, we have Maximilian Reck, who is a Professor of International Affairs and Program Director of ESCA Shanghai. In Brussels, we have Peter Klepp, Head of the Brussels office, Open Europe. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you directly, Mr. Reck. Professor, help us understand what does this mean when China and Europe vow together to talk and discuss about the rule-based international trade system within the WTO?
Yes. As a matter of fact, both China and Europe, and more particularly Germany, are very much interested in an open and free trade system that is underpinned by the WTO. Now, what we're currently looking at is a potentiality of reforming the WTO. As you know, last Friday, the European Union, China and India have submitted proposals to initiate reforms of the WTO, and I think that is a very good sign. That is a very good sign for a continued free and open trade system that both the far ends of Eurasia on the west and on the east are interested in maintaining. So this is something that we have to work on together, and I think that Liu He coming to Germany to discuss this ahead of the Buenos Aires G20 meeting is a very good start for the negotiations which are going to go forward for the next couple of months.
I see. Mr. Klepp, though, we see the EU earlier with the Brexit issue somewhat cleared up, even though we do not know the result yet. But the EU, how capable is it now, with Germany, for example, and France playing leading roles, be able to discuss international trade mechanism with China?
Well, the EU is still very active in trade, more active than ever, I would say. Indeed, they are on the verge of concluding a Brexit deal with the UK, but also the European Union has managed to close a trade deal with Japan, and before that with Canada. And currently, one of the priorities is to try to save the WTO, the World Trade Organization, because President Trump is refusing to appoint any new judges there. So the fears are that from next year on there would be no dispute settlement system or no functioning dispute settlement system anymore in the WTO. Of course, the EU is very keen to avoid a full-out trade war between China and the US, because this would also hurt the EU badly.
Right. Mr. Liu, listening to your European colleagues, I'm sure you have your own views about what kinds of cooperation is it that China could seek with the European countries and also the EU as well when it comes to this rule-based international trade system, Mr. Liu.
I think the international rule-based system is very important for both EU and China, and for the time being, I think with this summit in Hamburg, I think the both sides can see a very positive signal to the world economy that EU and China are going to the right direction, the direction of cooperation rather than in confrontation. We know Europe and China are big economies in the world. If the two sides take protectionism measures at the global stage, I think that will be economic disaster for the whole economy. I think both sides, EU and China, has drawn lesson from the Great Recession in 1920s. So it's a good signal for Europe and China to send to the world economy. And in the future, I think concrete measures could be expected during this summit. I think many scholars and business leaders are working hard for this summit, and concrete measures could be expected.
Right. Professor Reck, of course, you heard from both the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and also from Gerhard Schroeder, who's the honorary chairman of the conference, talking about cooperation always better than confrontation, despite differences that could exist between economies and among economies. Professor Reck, of course, this is taking place with the backdrop of U.S.-China apparent trade war and leading up to the G20 summit, in which the two presidents of the two countries likely to meet to ease the tension, at least in the trade. So, Professor Reck, when you heard China and some of the leading figures in Europe talking about this together, almost in the same tone, how much is it giving us confidence and resolve to the issue at all, Professor Reck?
No, I agree with you. I think, first of all, it's important to understand that communication is key. So talking is important. We know that our Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has been in Beijing only early on this month, in early November, and the German government is always very much interested in maintaining an open channel of communication with China, with the United States, and with other important trade partners around the world, most notably the Europeans. If we look at the fundamentals of the relationship between Germany and China, then we do see that we have a very prosperous trading relationship. We exchange some 186 billion euros, so probably a little bit more in US dollars. But if you look at the import and the export, the relationship is not as unbalanced. What does that mean? That means that Germany is actually not afraid to trade with China. We don't think that it is something negative. We see it as something very positive. So with a balanced trade relationship, that is something where we can build upon and where we can move forward. Now, you know that with the United States, the People's Republic of China maintains a trade balance which is much more unbalanced and in that sense not very healthy, maybe. And this is, I think, why in terms of the rhetoric that comes out of the White House, it is sometimes a little bit more confrontational. Now, Tianwei, you have mentioned confrontation. You have mentioned the difficult situation that we're currently facing. And I think that the European Union can have a very constructive, or can play a very constructive role in reforming the WTO. The proposals are on the table, but also try to engage China and engage the United States at the same time to arrive at a more, solution which is more cooperative in the future. And that is something that we need.
Professor Reck, I heard that kind of similar tones earlier, but the question is how? Is that wishful thinking for Europe or the European Union to be able to play a part in resolving the trade tension between China and the United States? After all, it was the first and the second largest economy in the world that are apparently in a trade dispute? And secondly, what role exactly is the EU or the major European capital cities are thinking about when it comes to their roles within the WTO? Can you be a little bit specific rather than abstract, Professor Reck?
Sure. As a matter of fact, if you think about what exactly needs to be resolved, it needs to be resolved to have all the member states of the WTO, the member countries, represented according to their share in the world economy. But apart from that, I think it is important to act within the international institutions. So what exactly needs to be done? We know that the dispute settlement mechanism is currently in a little bit of difficulty with regards to appointing new lawyers that can make up the appellate body. And here we need to go and provide, as the European Union has suggested on Friday last week, provide maybe a mandate which could be for a single appointment only and for a longer time period than previously. So not 2 times 4 years, but 1 time 6 to 8 years.
Okay.
This is a very useful solution. But the United States has one more very important concern, and that is investment from China and the unbalanced relationship with regards to trade. I think that Europe has the very same concerns. So what should we do? We should create a level playing field for our companies, and in this level playing field, in a market which is characterized by equal access to each other's consumer markets, in this kind of environment we can thrive. So creating a level playing field, reforming the WTO according to the suggestions that have been put forward,
all right,
that would be a good way forward, and then we can have a situation which is more positive and maybe less hostile in the next couple of years.
I see. And Mr. Liu, here from China, of course you would jump in on this occasion to help us understand China's understanding of some of the major European capitals' function in this regard, whether it is about trade ties between China and the United States or the overall, shall we say, improvement of the WTO with the current crisis, which is the appellate body almost collapsed at the very beginning of next year because of the United States refused to appoint judges to the appellate body. And Mr. Liu, what exactly can they play?
Yes, I think Europeans' positions are important because European is a big #1 economy in the world, and Europeans according to my own observation, Europe has been playing a role of reform of the WTO. As far as I know, last year in May, European Commission has launched a paper called Harnessing the Globalization, with lay out the Europeans' position about WTO. According to European Commission, I think there are some areas which is not managed by the WTO, so the European Union want to reform it. And I think the position is important because for the time being, when we talk about the WTO, because it will maybe in crisis next year because the block of the new nominees of the judges of the panel. So European position are important, particularly for EU and China to get a consensus. And I think, yes, I think we have different views from US, from European Union, and from China.
Yeah.
I think it's important for the EU and China to get consensus. Otherwise, maybe the WTO may be in crisis next year.
Yeah.
So,
Mr. Liu, if I could follow up about exactly China is thinking, I mean, from your scholar's perspective, I mean, besides interpret it and say it in a different way, is there much difference in terms of stance between the EU and the United States when it comes to pushing China about trade and economic ties in certain nature? That's one question, of course. Secondly is how much negotiating power or impact does really Brussels or other major European capital cities having on Washington at all? I mean, after all, will the EU or major European capital cities just become a force pushing China rather than the other way also, which is having an impact on the decision-making process of Washington? Mr. Liu.
I think why the WTO is complicated because the U.S. and the EU have both consensus and differences. And the consensus is that they have similar demand for China. For example, how to manage the overcapacity and the subsidies, which is not included in previous WTO regulation. And the difference is that, according to my observation, U.S. want to rebuild the WTO. If they cannot be satisfied, maybe they will pull out of the WTO. For the European Union, I think the European Union want to stay in the WTO. They want to maintain this mechanism. That's the major difference. So both China, EU, and US have both similar position and differences. So the reform is very complicated.
It is very complicated, and that's the fascinating part of it, isn't it? When it comes to this discussion, Mr. Klepp, of course, the European capitals do not see eye to eye with one another either. If you think about Germany, of course, is one of the biggest exporting country within the European Union. However, for example, France and some of the other economies are thinking differently. And also between Europe, Germany and others, also there are differences about where they should stand in trade. Obviously, different countries have different advantages and they want to protect their best interests. So in that regard, Mr. Klepp, help us understand how strong is the negotiation stance of Europe as a whole. And meanwhile, how much Germany will be able to achieve some kinds of persuasive power toward China given its current position now within the EU? Mr. Klepp.
Well, it's absolutely correct what you're saying, that there are big differences on trade policy between European countries. So you have the more liberal countries, you have the more protectionist countries. Some liberal countries may become more protectionist when a big part of their industry is facing competition. Now, I would not phrase this as winning or losing. You know, it's about trade. So ultimately, when you open up trade, the consumer has to be taken into account. So if you would see it as a concession, if Europe would open up more than China, for example, then that would be, I think, the wrong view. It would be a win for European consumers and would be a loss for Chinese consumers. Of course, there are some issues in Europe. People are concerned about the fact that China is still, to a certain degree at least, a state-led economy. We can disagree on to what extent, but to a certain degree it definitely still is, about things like intellectual property rights protection. And then people are wondering, should we actually open up competition to an economy that is largely state-driven, while we do not allow this at home in Europe? And I don't think there's an easy answer to give on that. But that discussion can easily be avoided if China would only move in the direction of more of a free market economy, which it has actually done to a great extent in the last 30 years. So if that process continues, then I don't think there's any concern about EU protectionism.
Right. Mr. Liu from China, you want to respond to your colleagues, first of all. Secondly, if I could bring in another topic, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, which involves China's cooperation with the European countries a lot. And that could be, some say, a new momentum for investments and also cooperation projects, not only inside the European economies, but also going to the third parties, for example, to Africa, to Latin America. And Mr. Liu, how much chance really is there that Europe and Chinese economies can really be able to build, particularly within a short period of time, given the complicated situation we're facing right now, both Europe and China?
I think that there are a lot more EU-China could do, particularly under the framework of Belt and Road Initiative. I think, according to my observation, European Union's attitude toward this initiative has been changing. During the first years, I think the European Union does not know well about the initiative, and later they may have some doubt or concerns about it. And recently, I found many European countries, including Germany, have a strong interest in this initiative. for example, the location of this summit in Hamburg. Hamburg is a big port of Germany, and is enjoys the Belt and Road Initiative. It has more export destinations, and EU and China also can work under the background of third-party cooperation. Because, for example, France, China can work together in Africa because many countries there are French-speaking, and France knows well in this area, and China and Spain can work together in Latin America. Similarly, I think there are a lot more EU and China could do.
Professor Reck, you know, it used to be said that trade and economic ties are the pillar of relations between countries and economies. But given the recent circumstances, it seems that that theory has been experiencing some test, to say the least. As a result of that, how is it this discussion between China and the European economies, this time, of course, in Hamburg Summit, likely to help us clarify what exactly will be the role of trade and economic ties between countries and in the global debate about where to go in geopolitics, Professor Reck?
Yes. Thank you, Tianwei. I think the questions that you just posed very much allude to one fact which we have to bear in mind. I think forums like the Hamburg Summit, China Meets Europe, provide an opportunity for civil society, for business leaders, but also for the Young Leaders Forum to get to know each other. And there they could look at the specific elements in trade and investment where we can actually add value. You mentioned the Belt Road Initiative just early on with Professor Liu. The Belt Road Initiative can be a very positive building block for further cooperation in the future. But you cannot forget that sometimes US companies, Chinese companies, and European companies are in competition to each other. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, where can competing companies cooperate along the Belt Road Initiative? And this co-opetition, where we're competing in some markets but cooperate in other markets, would be the way forward. And here we have to ask ourselves, okay, what are our strengths? What can we bring to the table? What is the added value that a German company such as Mr. Liu, Professor Liu has mentioned, the Port of Hamburg, they have perfect project management in the Port of Hamburg. They have software which can facilitate trade, which can render container terminals so much more efficient. And if we are able to implement the very same technology in other countries around the world, be it in Sri Lanka or be it in the Hanban port in Sri Lanka, or be it in Kenya, then this, I think, is a positive way forward. So ask yourself, take one step back, ask yourself, where can we add value and where can we cooperate, and that is what we should focus on.
Well, that is about trade and economic ties, but what about the overall trade and economic ties can play in bilateral, multilateral relationship? Mr. Clapp, I have to tap your expertise in that. Geopolitics is evolving very fast these days as we speak. Almost every month you see dramatic change and attitudes shifting. So what about that? The role of trade and economic ties still relevant for building better ties between countries and economies?
Well, it's been said that if goods do not cross borders, armies will. So this is the cornerstone of peace in the world, to allow companies to trade across border and not only create wealth but also create interdependence and stability. It is not sufficient. I mean, before the First World War you had a lot of trade and still the world slipped into war, but I think it's a necessary condition for global peace. Now I want to maybe mention one more thing about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's absolutely one example of the concerns that many Europeans will give when they refer to China as a source of unfair competition. So I'm really not so sure if this is a good initiative, because it will be used as an excuse, I think, to put up barriers against China, whereas what we've seen is that many of these projects, just like, of course, big EU projects, when they're funded by EU governments, have turned into white elephants. So I think China should probably reflect if this is really the best instrument to promote trade, and if it maybe should not instead rely on more traditional forms of promoting trade, for example, stepping up efforts to conclude trade deals. There still is no trade deal between the European Union and China, and both sides could dramatically gain from that.
That's true. There's still no free trade deals, for example, between China and Europe. Mr. Liu, you want to jump in about your colleague's comment about the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all?
Yes, I'd like to respond to the colleagues in Shanghai. But I think why the Belt and Road Initiative is serve the interests of both Europe and China. For example, let's take Hamburg example. I know that the management in Hamburg Port is good. I know that, but Hamburg Port needs business, and for Belt and Road Initiative means more business, more exportation, more shipping to the Hamburg. I think that will be serve the interest of Hamburg, and also I think there are also other opportunities for China and Germany to work with each other. For example, the infrastructure building. Belt and Road Initiative means more connectivity, means more infrastructure project. And I know many German enterprises are competitive, and they have a strong interest in the infrastructure building. They want to get involved in this project. I think the German enterprises don't want to be excluded from this project. That's also an opportunity for EU, for China and Germany to work together. I think that's a win-win initiative.
Isn't that interesting, Mr. Liu? I mean, I pick up from the earlier conversations and discussions with some of the business people from Europe, for example, different economies. On the one hand, the so-called public opinion and also media coverage of the Belt and Road Initiative is relatively somewhat negative, particularly recently. And yet, business are very eager to jump on whatever opportunity this Belt and Road Initiative could create, even though that could mean from time to time competition in some of the markets. How would you read this very mixed picture, and particularly at the very early stage of Belt and Road Initiative? After all, if you think about it, from the initiative was raised until now, it's less than 5 years. And during the 5 years, as we all know, not many infrastructure projects could be built within such period of time, not to mention its impact that could be seen. So, Mr. Liu, how do you read these mixed pictures?
It's really interesting. Europeans have a different opinion about the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, about 4 years ago, when I visited Europe, I found only a few people know the word Belt and Road Initiative. They don't know this at all. Recently, more and more people know this project, this initiative, but they have different views. I think one of the major reasons of the differences is that how the Belt and Road Initiative was covered in the European media. Because if we focus on the positive side, I think that many Europeans will know for a positive way. Because I think most people they have never visited China. They have knowledge about the Belt and Road Initiative. Whatever Europe still is just part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But we don't know that, so we need positive.
Right. Before we go, I do want to ask you also. Before we go, Professor Reck, I mean, on the one hand, you see this China-German Hamburg Summit. On the other hand, you see earlier Chinese Premier was interacting with many of the leaders of the European economies. And in a few days, Chinese President Xi Jinping is going to visit some of the other European countries, Spain, for example, Portugal, for example. You see these very frequent interactions between China and the Europeans. I do wonder what kind of message is this being sent to both the capitals between these two sides and also to the others, Professor Reck, before we go.
Yes. No, I think that both China and Europe are very rich in terms of the different cities, in terms of the different countries, or in China the provinces. And so we should think of a couple of bilateral relationships between the European Commission, for example, and Beijing. But on the other hand, we also have more than that. There's 27 member states of the European Union, which are all very happy to interact with their Chinese partners, whether they are in Portugal, in Spain, or in Germany. So in that sense, I think that the relationship goes beyond just high-level diplomatic delegations.
Right.
It is actually even the people that are interacting with each other, getting to know each other better. And I hope that this can actually lead to a better understanding in the future, because I do agree with you, sometimes public opinion is characterized by a mistrust and a lack of understanding, and the more we know about each other, I think the more we can actually learn from each other and potentially in the future have a better understanding and better cooperation forward.
Okay, I hope we start at least from discussions and even debates like this, as we have just put out for our audience worldwide. Thank you so much for the three of you, even though you have very different opinions on issues, but really appreciated your insights. And Maximilian Reck, Peter Klepp, Liu Ming Li. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.